Greetings and welcome to another lecture in psychopathology. We're continuing with the substance-related disorders. Specifically, what we're going to be talking about in this section are the stimulants. Now, stimulants do exactly what their name suggests. What stimulants do is they rev you up. They increase the activity of the central nervous system. And while they can and do have their purposes, very often they are used recreationally. Because another thing that stimulants tend to do is they tend to kick dopamine in the brain up into high gear. And since we tend to find that very pleasurable, at least up to a point where it drives us psychotic, human beings really like to use their stimulants. In fact, some of the most commonly used drugs recreationally, drugs are indeed stimulants, particularly legal ones. We're going to start with one of the stimulants that actually has both legal and illegal uses, although we don't tend to hear about the legal uses, and that's cocaine. Cocaine is an all-natural stimulant. It's an extract from the leaf of the coca plant, which grows wild in South America and, of course, has been cultivated in Central and South America. Like many of the other drugs that we're talking about here, many of the stimulants are essentially pesticides, in that what happens here is this cocaine, this stimulant that the plant has developed. The idea is that if a bug comes along and chows down on the leaf, it's going to get an overdose of the stimulant and it's going to die. The same, by the way, is true for nicotine, which we'll cover a little later. Cocaine was legal in the U.S. up until the early 1900s. What was happening basically at that point was cocaine was actually a fairly common ingredient in all sorts of things, including toothpaste. Now, it became illegal, as I said, in the early 1900s. Oh, and by the way, don't listen to what Coca-Cola tells you. Coca-Cola did indeed have cocaine in it for its early history, anywhere from 3 to 20 years, depending on who you ask. And in fact, it was called Coca-Cola because the taste came from an extract of the coca leaf, as did the cocaine, which was a stimulant, which caused people to want to drink it and actually drink even more of it and become hooked on it. When they removed the cocaine, they put in caffeine. Caffeine is not naturally found in cola unless it's added, in any great amount anyway. So, yes, indeed. Cocaine, by the way, does have legal uses. It's a very good topical anesthetic, in that if you rub it on the skin will go numb. Used to be sold as a toothache cure along with toothpaste. So if someone was having a toothache, you'd rub a little of that cocaine paste on the area that hurt and it wouldn't hurt anymore. And in fact, cocaine is still used in eye surgery. They put eye drops, cocaine eye drops, into the eye in order to numb it, or at least it can be used for that. Now, crack is a variant of cocaine and has been mixed with substances and processed in order to be best used for smoking. Cocaine in the original leaf is you just pick leaves and chew on them. Cocaine, the way we tend to think about it in this country, is where it has been processed and powdered, so it can be snorted, but it can also be processed for use in smoking. What it does in order to get that stimulating effect is it inhibits the reuptake, much the same way that SSRIs inhibit the reuptake of serotonin. So you have one molecule of dopamine that winds up sticking around for a while instead of basically being used once and recycled, which doesn't increase the amount. Well, it does kind of increase the amount of dopamine in the brain. It doesn't increase the amount that's released, but it increases the amount that's there by stopping recycling. Cocaine is one of those drugs, like the opiates, can actually cause both physical and psychological dependence. So your body can adapt and function better when it's on the drug, as well as your mind really, really wanting the drug. A lot of the dependence potential for the stimulants, even those that have physiological dependence, is psychological. People really like the way they feel when they're on this drug. Like all the other drugs we've been talking about, and all that we probably will talk about, the first step of treatment is detox. Get the person off the cocaine, and actually what people will often tend to do at that point is sleep for a very long time, because the stimulation basically is just, revving it up so much that it's a real problem. So we're going to calm them down. And then Cognitive behavior therapy can work, again, to try to work on the psychological issues that might be underlying it and also perhaps help prevent relapse or at least minimize relapse, as well as contingency management, which is also often operant conditioning, uh, reinforcement and punishment, that sort of thing, in the hope to get people to stop using this drug. Cocaine uh, can be quite dangerous. People have died from taking cocaine. And in a lot of cases, death by stimulant is not pleasant because usually what happens is the stimulant increases heart rate, it increases blood pressure, and the person dies from either a stroke or a heart attack. Um, and yeah, it's not particularly pleasant. People can and do die from cocaine use. Sometimes it only takes one dose. And if a person has an underlying physical vulnerability that has to do with their cardiovascular system, just that one dose might be enough to kill them. There at least were, I don't know if these are as popular nowadays, but it used to be that you could go into, gas stations and things, uh, convenience stores, and buy what were called bath salts. Now, they were called bath salts because that's how they were sold, with a wink wink and a nudge nudge and a know what I mean. Because they were sold as something that you would plunk in your bath. What people bought them for were to smoke and get high off of them. They were called synthetic cathinones. And they could be made out of almost anything. And the one thing they all had in common is they would just screw you up big time. These things, you never knew what was in them. It could be anything. And a lot of people would just go completely out of their minds on these things. And doctors would have no idea what had caused it because it could be made out of anything. Probably one of the most notorious examples is the guy that was on these when he killed and partially consumed a friend of his down in South Florida. Yeah. Uh, these are one of the things that basically there is no safe use for. So, like I said, I don't know if bath salts are still a thing, but if they are, I would stay the living, breathing hell away from them. They are really dangerous, much more so than most of these other stimulants, and that's saying something. Another type of stimulants are the amphetamines. Now, amphetamines are stimulants, and they did have an original use. They had a couple of original uses, and they still have legal uses today. For instance, people with ADD and ADHD may be on various types of amphetamines like Ritalin in order to control their symptoms. But originally, amphetamines were an inhalant, so you would be inhaling this in order to treat a stuffy nose, because one of the ways that stimulants rev you up is they activate the sympathetic nervous system. And the sympathetic nervous system, remember, is part of fight or flight. It gets you ready to deal with something. And one of the things that activating the sympathetic nervous system does is it reduces congestion, because you can't have, you don't want to have to worry about having a runny nose or a stuffed up nose if you're going to have to run for your life from a predator or something. And so, indeed, amphetamines, one of the things they do is they do indeed reduce stuffiness. They also can be used for weight loss. Stimulants, people on stimulants very often are not particularly hungry. And in fact, they used to be sold over the counter. You could buy over the counter amphetamines in order to hopefully lose weight, except until a whole lot of people started to get hooked on them otherwise. They can be also used to treat narcolepsy, those sort of irresistible bursts of REM sleep that come about for some people during normal daytime waking periods, as well as ADHD. I talked about that a little bit. Now, the one thing about stimulants is, and this is something that you might not get from the energy, commercials. They may not give you wings. They don't create energy. What they simply do is they cause you to burn more of the resources that you have. You can't create energy out of nothing. And normally your body has resources that it keeps in store for just in case. And what stimulants do is they cause you basically to dip into those and start working on these resources. And it's part of the reason why people coming off stimulants very often really want to sleep for a while to try to rebuild that, to try to rebuild all of those resources that they burned. And they just so happens they also increase dopamine in the brain, which is why we like them so much, along basically with that burst of energy that can be a lot of fun. Methamphetamine is a specific type of amphetamine. It can be made, these days, can be made almost anywhere, although it's extremely dangerous to make. There's a lot of very toxic chemicals that are used to make methamphetamine, and that also are kind of a byproduct of it. So it isn't necessarily something that you want to make because you're quite likely to poison and or kill yourself doing it or hurt people around you. Now, methamphetamine, for whatever reason, its particular chemical makeup tends to last longer than a lot of the other stimulants do. And because it lasts longer, it also seems to be able to cause perhaps more permanent change in the brain with long-term use. There's something called methamphetamine psychosis. And methamphetamine psychosis is when a person is so high on stimulants that they essentially start behaving like, actually in some ways, like they have schizophrenia, like they are psychotic. They may have hallucinations, they may have delusions, they may become paranoid, that sort of thing. It's not, as I said, just methamphetamine, can also be cocaine and other hardcore stimulants. And it's possible that these uses can also cause, as we said, long-term changes in the brain. Now, whenever you're talking stimulants, as I mentioned before, sort of in passing with cocaine, you're going to likely get both physical and psychological dependence. But the thing is, this physiological dependence is not nearly as bad as the psychological. And that's true for a lot of these drugs, even other drugs other than stimulants, in that you can get over the physical dependence relatively quickly. You can get over the physical dependence in terms of, the withdrawal symptoms in a week, maybe two. But the psychological dependence is going to stick around a whole lot longer than that. And we'll learn more about this when we cover the legal stimulants in the next video.